this piece at great length on Monday, the way the war transforms American society, right? It transforms the American economy. It transforms the American role of government. It transforms society for African Americans, for women, for Japanese Americans. The war absolutely changes American society. For today's conversation, we'll more so focus on the way in which the war is won and what that does for the U.S.'s role in the world moving forward. Up to this point in American history, what have we done with the rest of the world? Yeah, we've ignored it, right? Their problems, their issues, their nonsense, their conflicts. With World War II, as the war ends, the U.S. is put into a position, very importantly, it's in the College Board framework of global leadership, of political leadership, and of military leadership. That the U.S. going forward is going to be the big player on the world stage because everybody else is ruined. This time, as opposed to World War I, the U.S. does not shy away from the responsibility. Right? This just as easily could have happened in 1919. But this time, the U.S. does not shy away or run away from the possibility of playing a big role on the world stage, and instead embraces this leadership in a way that has never before been seen. So FDR makes this important speech that I think you should know, because it might not be on your testimony, I'm not quite sure, called The Four Freedoms. And he's arguing that what the U.S. is fighting for, why the U.S. is in the war, is a moral duty, an ideological belief, a high-minded understanding that the U.S. has the best values in the world, and we should fight to spread them. Right? These four freedoms that he argues, that the U.S. is going to fight for the freedom of speech. That everybody in the world should have the freedom to express themselves the way they want to express themselves. The U.S. is fighting for the freedom of worship. That everybody in the world should be able to worship their chosen God, their chosen deity, or not, in the way they best see fit. The U.S. is fighting for these things. But the U.S. is also fighting for a world in which people can live free from want. People shouldn't have to live in a world in which they need things and can't access them. All right, this is a good continuation of New Deal ideology. The government of the world should be there to guarantee people have what they need. And the people should also live in a world in which they are free from fear. People shouldn't live in a world in which they're scared, in which their government is going to attack or assault them instead of protect them. So these four freedoms kind of become the rallying call of what America is fighting for. Really, as we narrow down this idea that America's the good guy, those guys are the bad guys. Despite that, though, the U.S. enters the war, and it doesn't look good. It actually looks quite bad. As the U.S. enters the war in December of 1941, the situation is, to put it lightly, dire. Quite dire. By the end of 1941, the Nazis have literally rolled over all of mainland Europe. The Nazis have taken over, obviously, Poland, Belgium, France, with help from Italy, parts of Spain, and have now even controlled much of North Africa. So Nazi Germany is kind of at their peak of territorial conquest. And nobody's even really slowed them down. Nobody's even really slowed them down. The Japanese have done the exact same thing in the Pacific, to the extent that the Japanese have exerted their control, their influence over much of the Pacific Islands, like the Dutch East Indies, even much of mainland continental Asia. The Japanese have now controlled what's called French Indochina, modern day the countries of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. The Japanese are going to soon control our colony of the Philippines. The Japanese are going to exert their control over the Pacific Islands, much the way that the Nazis have done on mainland Europe. Right after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. forces are kicked out of the Philippines. Right, this big island group in the Pacific that we've been holding on to since the Spanish-American War. Douglas MacArthur is the famous general who was in charge of the Philippines. He's a big war hero. People think he's a big deal. He gets kicked out almost immediately by Japanese forces. The Japanese forces take 11,000 U.S. prisoners of war. It's a lot. 11,000 U.S. prisoners of war just from the Philippines. And they are marched across the Philippines in what's now known as war crimes, crimes against humanity, in the Bataan Death March, in which thousands of U.S. prisoners of war die, are killed by the Japanese, die because of this long miles and miles and miles march across the Philippine Islands through marshes. So it's all bad. It looks really, really terrible. Right? Japan, by 1941, into 41, and early 42, is at the peak of its territorial control as well. So the U.S. is entering the war in which they only have one ally. Who is that ally? Yeah, just Great Britain, right? And Great Britain's over here like, yeah, we're kind of struggling too because we've been holding on all this time waiting for you guys to get in. Waiting for you guys to get into the war. So things look bad. Things look really bad. And that's why propaganda like what you just saw is important, because it at least encourages the ideas of America belief in winning this war, despite the fact that it doesn't look like they're going to. So of course, it is here that Hitler makes his terrible military mistake. Right? In Europe, Hitler has nobody left to fight except the British. Right? We talked about this Battle of Britain on Monday, in which he's bombing Britain. What he does instead is turns to the east and invades the Soviet Union. Now, up to this point, we have this Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. They're not going to fight each other. Hitler violates that because he hates communism. He hates communism. He doesn't want to see communism present in Europe after the war. But in doing so, he violates everything about military strategy that anybody that knows military strategy thinks. It's a huge mistake. So June 22nd of 1941, Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa. The name's not important. But he sends 4 million men. That's a big-ass army. 4 million men into the Soviet Union to hopefully topple the Soviet Union, take over the Soviet Union, and spread his ideologies into Eastern Europe and Asia. Now, what do you guys know about the Soviet Union? A couple things. A, it's cold. Sure, what else?
Communism.
It's big. It's freaking huge. And 3, yes, communism. What else?
It's a lot of forest.
A lot of forest. Stop coughing. I'm trying to teach you, bro. What else do we know about the Soviet Union? A lot of people. A lot of people. So Hitler sends 4 million men in the Soviet Union, a place that is massive, a place that is cold, and a place that has a freaking F ton of people. That's the only natural resource the Soviets have to bring to the table in this war. Like, are you awesomely industrialized so you can help fight this war? No. Do you have awesome weapons? No. What do you have? People. Yes, sir.
Don't the Russians burn their resources as the Hitler pushes
Yeah.
forward?
So as the Soviets retreat, what this is happening for the Nazis is they're lengthening their supply lines. They're making it harder and harder to resupply their men because they're getting farther and farther from Germany. Germany doesn't move. The army moves, and then it gets harder and harder to resupply them, and the Nazis are like, we don't care. We'll just burn all of our crops. We'll burn all of our stuff. We'll burn all of our factories. Because the Soviets are like, well, we just have people. All we have is millions upon millions upon millions of dudes. The Soviets are like, we'll fight forever. We'll just send dudes out there with rocks. Yeah, and they're gonna die at a 10-to-1 Soviet to Russian ratio. Who cares? So what Hitler miscalculates is how easy this is going to be, because the large miscalculation comes in how many men the Soviets are willing to lose and say, oh well. Millions of Soviet civilians die because of famine during the war because the Soviets burn all their crops. Right? We can't have them. The Germans can't have them. Who cares? People will die. So the German army quickly advances into Russia, but does so at a huge cost. For the next 4 years, 3.5 years, 90% of German casualties in the war will happen in the Soviet Union. We look at like DDay and America and England, and it's all great. No, 90% of the Germans that die in this war are dying on the Eastern Front fighting the Soviets. 90%. So really, after the war, it's the Soviets that feel like they defeated Germany. Are they right? Yeah. To a pretty decent extent. So by the end of 1942, it looks like the war is almost over, and it's not a good thing. Right? The Allies have lost a bunch of important battles. Hitler is marching into the Soviet Union and getting very far. Japan has all kinds of control. And it looks on the surface like this war is about to end, and it is about to end in favor of the Axis powers. However, these short-term victories, they disguised some flaws in the way that the Axis powers were conducting their war. The two big military powers that are being fought, Italy plays such a minor role. It's like the video, like the cartoon, right? Mussolini's preaching to this big crowd of one. Right? The Italian contribution is very minimal. So largely it's just Germany and Japan. But Germany and Japan never coordinate with each other. They never discuss how they could help each other, how they could create strategy that would help each other win this war. And instead they just fight this own war isolated from each other. They're both fighting the same country. They're both fighting the United States. But both countries, both of them, choose to fight different wars on two fronts. Japan is fighting the US on one side, China on the other. A two-front war. Germany is fighting the US and Britain on one side, Soviet Union on the other. So both countries fight a two-front war and never attempt to work together to figure out how they can help each other. And they don't. And these early defeats obscure the two things the Allies have going for them. But I want you to understand that the two things the Allies have going for them are advantages in a long war. Soviet men, because the Soviet Union can just keep throwing army after army after army after army and having them all die and just keep rolling. It's like they have men on an assembly line. It's crazy. And U.S. industrial production. Those two advantages are only benefits, though, in a long war. So as the war prolongs, these advantages start to exert themselves. Very similar to the North during the Civil War. Very similar to the North during the Civil War, right? The South won a bunch of early battles, and it was, okay, that's fine. The North has more men. The North has more industrial capacity. So over time, these are long-term advantages that take time to actually exert themselves. Literally, all the Soviets bring to the table is millions of men and a lot of vodka. It's the Soviet way. Soviet way. So, looking at what happens in Europe, looking at what happens in what's called the European theater, a couple things are important. I know the map, it's kind of hard to see. Militarily speaking, this is one of the only wars that might actually matter on the AP test military-wise. So we see on the map, here's Germany. Germany's in the middle. Right? By 1942, Germany has conquered France. They've conquered much of southern Europe. As you can see, they've conquered much of North Africa. And at this point, all that's left Allied-wise is the island of Great Britain. The island of Great Britain. And rather than invade Great Britain with those 4 million men they're going to send east, they turn around and they invade the Soviet Union. All right, now you can see geographically why it was dumb. All right, why not put those 4 million dudes on boats and end the war? Could have happened. Didn't happen. Right? Why? Because dictators are very self-absorbed. Totalitarian leaders are all about what makes them look great. And I don't think Hitler wanted to live in a world in which him and Stalin shared this sphere of influence in Europe. Invade the Soviet Union. So as you can see, they make it all the way by early 1943. All the way to Stalingrad, Moscow, and Leningrad. 3 of the main cities in the Soviet Union. It is here in Stalingrad, 1942-43. It's a long siege, and eventually the German supply lines are too long to keep resupplying their soldiers, and the Soviet Union army begins to push the Germans back. That's as far as the Nazi influence ever reaches. Right here at Stalingrad is where the Soviet army, with their extensive manpower, begins to push back on the Nazis. But to Noé's point, like, here's the border of the Soviet Union. So the Nazis make it really far. But the farther they go, the farther they are from Germany and the less access they have to resources. As you guys read, Stalin is begging and pleading and asking Churchill and FDR to please open a second front in Europe. Stalin's like, dude, I'm the only one fighting Nazis here. You got to help me out. He's saying that if the British and the Americans invade Europe, that will cause Hitler to send some of his forces back. Reasonable, right? Eventually, the Allies open a second front, but Stalin's very upset. It is not where he wants it. They instead open a second front in North Africa. which is called Operation Torch. And it's this beginning of a foothold, or the beginning of Allied influence back in mainland Europe. They start in North Africa, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Egypt, and eventually go from North Africa and invade Italy. Right? Italy is the France of the Axis powers. What do I mean by that? Yeah, they fall over really quickly. Italy's like, wait, what? We got invaded? No, we're done. Sorry, we were just kidding. We're just messing with y'all. We're back to our wine, back to our cheese, back to minding our own business. We're cool. So, as soon as the Allied powers invade Italy, up through southern Europe, Italy folds, much like France often does. And the Allied powers begin to close back in on Germany. Right? By 1943, the Soviet army is coming this way. The Allied army is coming this way. And the big turning point in the war comes actually in D-Day. Right? It's the only battle actually listed in the College Board framework, so it's kind of important, and it's important to life. Any of you have seen Saving Private Ryan, for example? That's it. Good movie. I've never seen it.
I thought you had it.
I don't watch movies. But D-Day is monumentally important. As American forces, British forces, Canadian forces, Australian forces. Canada offers like 8 dudes. Thank you, Canada. And a moose. You can swim across the English Channel, right? With Teddy on it. And D-Day is launched. It's the biggest overseas invasion in world history. All right, as we put tens of thousands of men across the British Channel onto the shores of Normandy, which are heavily fortified by Nazi defenses. It is a successful invasion. The Allies get their foothold here in mainland Europe, and from there, it's just a matter of time. So for the next year, the Soviets are closing in this way. The Allied forces are closing in this way. The Soviet forces are coming through southern Europe as well. That'll play a big role in the Cold War, I promise. And British and American forces are coming from Normandy, where D-Day was, in towards Germany. So on 3 sides, Germany is losing its territory, and losing its territory quite quickly. Just about a year, 11 months after D-Day, we have Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, in which Nazi Germany quits, they surrender, Hitler kills himself, and the war in Europe is over. So again, this is a war of industrial capacity and power and men. Right? Over time, Hitler's early expansion is countered by how much the US can produce and how many men the Soviet Union can just throw into the war. Now in the Pacific, it's a similar story. It's funny because who attacked us first? Yeah, Japan, right? And so we go and fight Germany. And we leave Japan with a little stiff arm like this. Like, we'll get to you guys. All right, you guys, like a little kid that keeps swinging. All right, we'll get to you. We promise. We'll come deal with you in a minute. We're going to go deal with them first. So the U.S. is actually the only country in the world at this time that's properly equipped to fight a two-front war. Why? Why is the U.S. able to fight a two-front war when nobody else really can? Go ahead. Okay, everybody else is beat up. Sure. What else?
They're port in Hawaii.
What?
They have a port in
Hawaii helps. Production. Big deal. Yeah, none of our land is messed up. And we don't have land. Nobody's going to invade us. We can fight both wars on our terms. What do we have on our western border?
Ocean.
Ocean. Good. What do we have on our eastern border?
Ocean.
Ocean. So unlike other countries, nobody's going to just come across the border and invade us. So we can kind of take our time, get to it when we get to it, build up our industrial capacity, right? And we have enough people. The other countries in the world that are mass industrialized don't have massive population. England, France, Germany. The other countries that have massive populations, Soviet Union, don't have the kind of industrial capacity the United States have. So the United States has both and can then fight this war over the course of the next 4 years kind of on their terms. Now, in the Pacific, it's similar. Now, Pearl Harbor, you guys all know. Pearl Harbor is here. Pearl Harbor does not go well for the U.S., but it could have gone worse. Much of the U.S. fleet, the U.S. ships, are actually out of the harbor doing a training exercise and are then not sunk. And just 6 months later, the Japanese try to do it again. the Japanese are going to try to take the Midway Islands, which are here very close to Pearl Harbor. They're going to try to take the Midway Islands so that they can then launch whatever attacks they want on Pearl Harbor, and then eventually conquer Pearl Harbor and leave the U.S. without any base of action in the Pacific Ocean. Right? The closest U.S. port to Pearl Harbor is San Diego, like here. So if the U.S. lost Hawaii, it would not be good. At the Battle of Midway, though, by this point, 6 months into the war, the U.S. has already tapped the Japanese secret code. The U.S. has already, with code breakers, women play a huge role in this, in linguistics and figuring out what the Japanese are doing. The U.S. already knows what's coming. So the U.S., despite having a smaller naval force at this point than the Japanese, because of Pearl Harbor, is able to intercept the Japanese forces at Midway, and that becomes almost like, not the D-Day, but the Battle of Stalingrad here in the Pacific. And that becomes as far as the Japanese get influence and control-wise. So post-Battle of Midway, 3 of the Japanese destroyers, their big battleships, get sunk. It's a disaster for the Japanese. From that point forward, what happens in Europe also happens in the Pacific. Gradually pushing and pushing and pushing until you're close enough that Japan kind of just has to give up. So the Battle of Midway is monumentally important. But you can see this dotted line. This is the farthest line of Japanese control, which is July of 1942, right after Midway. But look how much control the Japanese had. They literally controlled the entire South Pacific, all the way to the Alaska Islands and much of Russia, China, Indochina, chunks of India. The Japanese controlled a ton of land. So the U.S. embarks on this strategy, which is called island hopping. The U.S. would fight like hell for one island, get the Japanese off that island, regroup, and then hop to the next island. So gradually over time, right, it starts down here, bless you, with Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Lake Gulf, Okinawa. So gradually over time, you're seeing the U.S. taking back the area the Japanese had conquered. The U.S. retakes the Philippines as promised. Douglas MacArthur, when he got kicked out the first time by the Japanese army, says, "I'll be back." He does go back. He's very proud of himself. He's Douglas MacArthur. You'll read about him more in the Korean War next week. But eventually, the Japanese become to get desperate. Right? At the Battle of Lake Gulf in October of 1944, so 2 years later, they begin using kamikaze pilots or using Japanese planes with pilots in them to fly and crash into U.S. boats to try to sink the boats. Right? They're basically just suicide missions by Japanese pilots. What I want to know is why those pilots wore helmets. Seems like a waste of a helmet. Like, you're going to die anyway, bro. Same question, why do they put seatbelts on airplanes? What's that going to do? It's not going to save my life if we crash. So, very famously, the Battle of Iwo Jima is this monumental picture I'm sure you guys have all seen of 3 Marines putting the flag up on the top of a hill as the U.S. is gradually just taking island after island until getting to Okinawa, which I'll talk about here in a second. So by 1945, right, we've been in the war for 3.5 years, it becomes clear that the Japanese are not going to give up. The U.S. instead embarks on a strategy of bombing civilians. It's a strategy we've been using in Germany. England's been using it in Germany. We've been bombing civilians basically all war. But the U.S. embraces this idea of targeting civilians to try to convince the Japanese to surrender. 66 major Japanese cities are bombed. Tokyo, the biggest city in Japan, is actually firebombed for months. They're dropping flammable explosives. They don't just explode. They start fires on the ground when they explode. To the point where what we do to Tokyo is arguably, in some ways, even worse than the atomic bombs, destruction-wise. If you go to Tokyo now, it's a brand new, awesome, modern city. It's like, oh, why is this big, old city so modern? Well, because it all got burned down in World War II. They got to rebuild it in the 1950s. So the U.S. kills over 500,000 civilians in Japan. What do you guys think? Is this justified?
To an extent.
No, is it really? I mean, it's war.
Democracy's at risk. Democracy's at risk? Sure, it's an opinion question.
Oh, hey, Mr. Winchell. Didn't Japan, kill some civilians and
So that makes it.
Harbor?
So that makes it okay.
Yeah.
So they kill 6 civilians at Pearl Harbor, and we kill 500,000 other civilians. Get this, because it's America. All right. But once we have the Battle of Lake Gulf won, Japan is completely blockaded. Japan can't get goods in or out. Their navy is destroyed. They have all these big battleships they have to start the war have all been sunk. And this is where they begin their kamikaze flights because they don't have much other options to deal. The invasion of the island of Okinawa tells a phenomenal story. Right? The U.S. Navy and Marines and Army invade this island off the coast of Japan, and all 110,000 Japanese defenders die. Because the Japanese refuse to surrender on an individual basis and on a societal basis. They refuse to surrender. So they just die instead. Monumentally important, because that tells us, as strategy-wise, the Japanese aren't going to surrender. If we invade this island, the invasion won't be over until a monumental amount of people are dead. So it is there that we begin this discussion of using the atomic bomb. Now, the Manhattan Project is the project created during World War II to create the capturing of atomic power. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer successfully tested the first atomic bomb in the desert of New Mexico in the summer of 1945. It was a very top secret project. The vice president of the United States didn't even know it existed until FDR died. And he's like, okay, cool, you're president now. Congratulations, here's this awesome bomb. What do you want to do about it? He's like, wait, what? We have what? FDR dies 4 months into his fourth term as president after winning in 1944. And Harry Truman is the president left in charge of this decision. However, if the U.S. were to invade mainland Japan, the actual island of Japan, a conservative estimate, a low estimate, says probably about 350,000 American casualties would take place. Because of this idea that they're not going to surrender. So what do you do instead? You just drop atomic bombs. August 6th of 1945, shortly after we've captured this power, the Enola Gay drops the first ever in the world atomic bomb on Hiroshima, an industrial city in Japan, killing 140,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more are injured. For the next 3 generations, people are dying of abnormal cancers because of the radiation from the bomb, and 80% of the buildings in the city are destroyed. 80%. The Japanese still don't surrender.
What?
Yeah, the U.S. is like, we have more. The Japanese are like, bring it. So the U.S. drops a second atomic bomb 3 days later on Nagasaki. It's a smaller city. It's less. It's more of like a hill city. So 70,000 people die. 60,000 are injured immediately. And the Japanese still don't surrender. And the U.S. is like, we have more bombs. We will do this until you surrender. The Japanese surrender 5 days later. It's a good thing because the U.S. does not have any more bombs. It would have taken about 3 or 4 more months. They only had 2 to start this process. They hoped 2 was enough. 2 was enough. The Japanese surrender. And the thing I want to fast forward to, I'll talk about the war conferences next week. But the most important thing that comes out of the war is the Depression is over and the United Nations is created. The U.S. does not run away from a role in the world in the League of Nations. And the United Nations is created. The U.S. plays a key role in its creation. The U.S. is a member of the Security Council, which are the most important countries in the United Nations. And the U.S. embraces this new leadership role in the rest of the world, which is a full change from every other piece of American history in which the U.S. shied away from world leadership, global leadership. Nicely done. I only mentioned the UN at the very end because it may play a role on one of your writing prompts for tomorrow. Just a recommendation, and extensively in your reading as well. So this idea that the U.S. is going to play a role in the rest of the world leadership-wise matters. Have a great day. I will see you tomorrow. Make sure you hustle to class.